cold.
You ever seen fire at 0 gravity? It's beautiful.
Who knows where it's been? What it's seen? And what it's brought back with it? From hell.
The most destructive force in the universe.
Oh my God.
I was a big fan of science fiction from when I was a kid. You know, I used to read all those trashy paperback books. All those science fiction books with really great front covers. And really, so I've loved science fiction since I was a kid. And in terms of cinematic influences, I was always heavily influenced by American cinema and French cinema. When I was growing up, there wasn't anything particular in British cinema that I really, really liked and responded to. So my influences are more from continental Europe and from America.
Event Horizon first came to our attention because we were looking for a very scary project. We'd just done Mortal Kombat and Shopping, which were quite light projects, and Paul wanted something very dark. At that point, he was particularly obsessed with The Shining.
I was sent the script of Event Horizon by Paramount Pictures. I'd just done my second film, my first movie in Hollywood, which was Mortal Kombat, which was had been a big hit in the States. So I got sent quite a lot of scripts.
And we heard about the script Event Horizon, and Larry Gordon and Lloyd Levin had been developing it with Paramount, and they sent it over to us, and it was really interesting because it was a ghost story, but it was in space.
In Philip's original script, the reason for the kind of manifestations and the haunting, as it were, is that there were aliens, kind of like these tentacular aliens and the Event Horizon had been to their planet or been to their dimension, and the aliens were inhabiting the spaceship. And I didn't want to go in that direction because, in my opinion, there's one great monster in space, and that's the alien, and I didn't want to make a monster movie in space.
My first reaction to Philip Eisner's script was this was a terrific concept, but it was very dense. It was a little bit overwritten, and the story got a little bit lost. The concept wasn't ultimately very clear. Paramount felt this was a great concept, but they needed a vision. So Paul came along and said, I'm going to make a really terrifying ghost story in space.
I wanted to make a more traditional classic haunted house movie. And I think what's good about movies like The Shining, and also another movie that had a big influence on this film, which was Robert Wise's The Haunting. You know, those movies, they don't show you the monster, they don't show you the ghosts, they don't show you the creature. And I think that's very important for why those movies have remained classic films. And incidentally, why those movies, when they were first released, weren't big successes. You know, The Shining was not a big hit when it first came out. It was considered a disappointment. It didn't get great reviews. And it slowly became a classic over time. I think, you know, for the reason that, you know, what the fuck is that ending about? I mean, who knows? You know, the ending of The Shining, it's not definitive. It doesn't tell you exactly what happened. And I think it's those kind of ambiguities, which you also find in The Haunting, Robert Wise's version, that make those classic films. And for that reason, I didn't want aliens in the movie. I wanted something less specific than that. I liked the whole idea of hell. I liked the whole idea of the ship itself being possessed, rather than going, oh, it's an alien consciousness that's doing this.
My first task as the producer on Event Horizon was to establish where we were going to shoot this film. Larry Gordon gave me a great deal of freedom as his producing partner and colleague on the film, which I really am grateful for and respect. We needed a lot of stages. Paul wanted to build a lot. Paul has a tremendously strong visual imagination, and he wanted the ship to be unlike anything you've ever seen. He wanted it to have a very religious overtone. So my first task was twofold: to find the place in England that I could actually shoot this, that had enough stages available, and then to find the production designer. Pinewood at that time had enough space. I think Stanley Kubrick was just finishing or in the middle of Eyes Wide Shut, which had been shooting for about 2 years at that point. But we had enough, they had enough stages for us, particularly the Bond stage. We needed a very big stage because the scene in the Daylight space station, where you are in on Sam Neill in his little cubicle, and he's shaving. We pull out, we pull out, we pull out. That was a massive shot. It required like a 60-foot track, so it's revealing that he's in space. So I needed a stage that was big enough for that. I also needed a stage that had a tank. So the Bond stage in Pinewood was ideal. Then I had to get a production designer, and Paul has a kind of co-designs a lot of his movies. So I needed a designer who was really very collaborative, and we met Joseph Bennett, who had really only done one notable film, but it was a great film, this film Jude, that based on the Jude the Obscure book by Thomas Hardy, and it had a really interesting, visceral style to it, which Paul really responded to. So we gave him the gig, and now that was a big gig for a young designer. But as I said, Larry Gordon and the studio gave us quite a lot of freedom to just bring in the people we wanted.
Paul Anderson's brief was very loose, but said, you know, what we want to try and do is let's try and achieve a space film with a look that hasn't been seen before, which is a nebulous brief and very challenging, because, you know, the trouble with anything set in space, there's so much history about designs of movies set in space that it's very difficult to do something completely different without it looking arch or over-designed. And I think it's a difficult balance to achieve between having something that looks kind of phony or over-designed and having something that looks realistic. And it's a balance that, you know, we were very kind of conscious of, I think, on Event Horizon.
Joseph set about designing this ship, and Paul came up with this idea that the ship should be like Notre Dame Cathedral. So the ship has a very long centerpiece, which is like an aisle, and at the end, it's like an altar. So immediately you're watching this movie and you're going into something a little metaphysical with these religious overtones, because essentially the ship is going to take you to hell.
We scanned Notre Dame Cathedral into the computer in LA, and then we kind of deconstructed it and tried to build a spaceship out of it. So the kind of the side thruster portions of the Event Horizon are actually the towers of Notre Dame Cathedral turned on their side. And a lot of that, you know, really did find its way into the movie. All of the metal superstructure of the event, that's all in the central section, that is all based upon the designs of the stained glass window from Notre Dame Cathedral. So there's an awful lot, if you ever go visit that cathedral, you do see the Event Horizon.
Paul was constantly pushing and saying, oh, how can we do this better? How can we make this more exciting? He had this great phrase, which is more is more.
And you can see things like in the medical bay, for example, you see the big, fat stone pillars that you would find in a Gothic cathedral. You see stained glass windows. When Jason Isaacs is crucified, it's in front of, you know, a triptych of stained glass windows, but they're kind of rendered in a very modern form. Because
we had such a short prep time, we needed, you know, a lot of good people, and we were very fortunate. We got some fantastic crew. Obviously, working at Pinewood Studios, working at one of the premier film studios in the UK. You know, there was some fantastic crew available, and we had like several art directors, for example, because so many big sets that needed looking after and building concurrently. We had, I think, maybe 4 art directors, big team of people drawing stuff up. It was, you know, it was a big show. Paramount gave me a pretty, you know, they gave me pretty free rein to choose the crew that I wanted. So all of the crew were handpicked by me. You know, that happens in Hollywood. If your last movie was a big hit, you really get to do whatever you want.
Adrian Biddle is an astonishing DP. I've never known a DP be able to light so brilliantly without moving from his seat beside the monitor. He sits there with his cigar and his black coffee and his copy of the London Times, and he's got all of these electricians running all over the place, doing these huge lighting designs, and it just looks like he does it with so much ease. He's so confident, he's so experienced.
You know, he gets a lot of offers. He's a very in-demand cameraman, and I really wanted him. So I wooed him over. So what I did was, when I met him, I took a whole reference book of photographs of what I thought the look of the movie should be. So, you know, shots of, just a lot of photography, like shots of corridors that had unbalanced fluorescent lights in them, so that the negative, when you print it, the photograph comes out with that kind of cyan green, which is, we always called unpleasant green, because it just looks unpleasant, it makes you feel unsettled. And that was the kind of look that I wanted for the interior of the Event Horizon. And I took him a lot of kind of architectural photographs as well. And I think he was obviously very excited by the vision that I had for the movie, and then he built upon that. So he was actually the first person we signed to the picture. I remember we had Adrian Biddle on board before we signed any of the actors. So it was very much a design and look-led movie. Because you had the director and the DP working on it before you really had any of the actors involved in it. We were building the sets again before we were fully cast.
I mean, he's just a genius. I mean, we were so lucky to have him, and he really helped us on this film, because we had quite a young crew in certain areas, but visual effects, we had Richard Urisic, tremendous experience. Adrian Biddle, worked with Jim Cameron. He did Aliens. He was the focus puller on Alien. Tremendous amount of experience, but then pockets of young talent like Joseph Bennett, the designer, which is really how Paul and I like to do it. We like to mix it up. You don't want to have everybody who's done 30-odd movies. It's nice to have some young energy and some new ideas in there, as well as the experience. But Biddle was just extraordinary. I mean, honestly, he would sit there and achieve great things, and it made it look like it was so easy.
Nothing would ever fluster him. And we do some shots that to this day, I think Event it's got the best looking stuff I ever shot in it. It's got some amazing shots. And Adrian would never admit anything. You just shoot these amazing looking shots and you go, that's nice. And that would be the most you'd ever get out of him. Nice was as good as we ever got. I was very excited to work with John Mollo because obviously I'm heavily influenced by the works of Ridley Scott, who is a genius and one of the best filmmakers living today. And I was excited to work with John Mollo because he'd obviously worked on the first Alien movie. And for two reasons I was excited to work with him. One, he was very talented, obviously, but also he'd encountered a lot of the difficulties that we were going to encounter before. So, for example, the way that in the first Alien, all of the helmets fog up, which actually looks quite cool in Ridley's movie, but was a mistake. It was really difficult apparently to work in those helmets. And they only spent a small portion of the movie in the helmets. We were going to spend a lot more time with our characters wearing the helmets, so we couldn't afford them to fog up. And John had all that kind of experience. He knew where to put little fans inside the helmets to keep the actors cool, to make sure the faceplate wouldn't mist up. He was a very an unusual thing for a costume designer is to be very talented when it comes to like the flair of designing costumes, but also combine that with great practicality, which is something we had to do.
Cut. Unzip your flight suit and then take off.
Oh.
No, sorry. What I want to do is keep your t-shirt, yeah?
Yeah.
And then take the arms off and then kind of wrap them around. You know how you wear flight suits when they're half down? Yeah, that's it.
It was one of the problems we had on the film was the actors were just weighed down by the spacesuits. They took forever to put on, it took like 45 minutes to get them in the boots, the suits, the big backpacks, the helmets. Then once they were in those suits, they could only spend like 10 minutes in them because the weight was so incredible that they just couldn't stand it. Even physically big, tough guys like Fishburne, he just couldn't stand up for more than 5-10 minutes. So we ended up building these resting posts for them. That were, because they couldn't sit in a standard chair because they would just break the chair. And also they couldn't sit down because the backpack wouldn't allow them to. So we built these kind of leaning posts and they would just lean against them and get a bit of rest. It was, for the actors, it was a movie that was filled with physical discomfort.
Lawrence Fishburne is an awesome individual. He has such gravitas, such presence. I was very, very excited to be working with him. He was extremely professional. he really, it's great when you have an actor like that within your crew, within your cast, because he sets a standard. You know, this man was in Apocalypse Now, you know. Obviously this was before Matrix, but he still was such a big star for Paul and I. He'd done so many movies that we really liked, but he was really easy to work with. But one of the great things about him is you just cut to him and he's got such presence, he doesn't really have to do much. So he's worth millions of dollars just in that presence alone.
You know the rules, people. If someone drops the ball, we get the call. Now, let's go.
Fish loved the movie. That was, you know, he really, really liked it. A friend of mine met him in New York about a year and a half after he'd finished filming Event Horizon. And he was wearing his full outfit, you know, the flight suit, the Captain Miller flight suit.
I was very intimidated by working with Lawrence because he's a big American film star and he's kind of very cool and charismatic, and you know, he's nominated for an Oscar, and he's, you know, he's just a brilliant actor. So the first day that I worked with him, or rather he was doing a scene, I come to visit the set and I was introduced and he shook my hand and I kind of went a little bit, and he did something. I think he walked across a room looking for something, and then he came over and stood next to me while we were watching the playback, and he went, "Do you think that was all right?" I said, "What, me?" He said, "Yeah, was that, what do you think, that was all right?" I said, "Yeah, well, yeah, it was great, really." Anything like, he said, "Well," and then I made some comment, God only knows why, I made some vaguely critical comment about you could have gone and looked in the cupboard or something, and he went, "Okay." And he went away and I thought, what did I do? Why didn't I just tell Lawrence Fishburne how to look in the cupboard? But we hit it off. We got on incredibly well. And in order not to be intimidated by his general superstardom and macho coolness, I called him Florence. And then the rest of the crew took it up. It was called Florence by a lot of people, which I think took him by surprise at first, but he took it in good stead after a while.
One of my favorite memories of Fish, though, is actually off the set. He was such a cool guy. And we set up this gym because all of the actors had to do a lot of wire work in the spacesuits. They had to be hung upside down, they were put into harnesses. And it's physically very difficult, so they had to be in very, very good shape. So we had a big gym set up at Pinewood for the actors, and they'd go in there at the end of the day. And at that point in my life, I was still trying to remain slightly fit, so I would go running at the end of the shooting day. And I went into the gym and there was just me and Fish, and his favorite exercise was to hang upside down from these gravity boots, you know, those bars that you hang upside down from. So I walk into the gym and he's hanging upside down, because usually he'd do like sit-ups upside down. He's hanging upside down like a big bat, looking really cool. He's the only guy who can hang upside down and look cool. So he's hanging upside down and he says, "Hi, Paul," and we have this conversation and we talk about this and we talk about that. And slowly he works his way around to what he really wants to say, which is he can't get up. But he's too cool just to get to the point and go, "Oh, Paul, I can't get up, will you give me a hand?" We have to have a whole conversation first. And then eventually, because his stomach muscles were like so exhausted, and then I had to kind of help him up. But he was a great guy to work with. I hope we will work together again.
Sam Neill, also terrific, very professional. You know, we had a very social time on that film. I gave the cast membership to this new club that just opened in Soho, the Soho House, and every Friday night I would take a room there, and we would all sit around and talk, and we became friends. And Sam is still a very good friend and an excellent actor. I mean, like, Paul and I were only 29, 30 years old, so it was great to have this experience behind us.
I'd always seen Sam playing these authority figures. He plays, you know, kind of reactionary figures. He's often buttoned up and repressed, and I was rather taken aback at what kind of loose, free spirit he is, kind of embodying, I don't know about the 60s, but whatever he is, he's certainly not the characters he plays on screen. It took me a while to make the adjustment and realise he was a real love and incredibly mischievous. And he was there with his wife, Noriko, and they just loved to have a good time. And they were, you know, when we all went out, they were the last people to leave. And so he was one of the people that was tremendously good fun to do a scene with, because I don't think he takes acting too seriously. Not that he's not very good at it, but I think he thinks it's a rather silly way to make a living, and that comes across when you work.
One thing I can say about Sam Neill is if you've never worked with him, please keep your fingers crossed that you're going to work with him, because he is the guy. He's really quiet, very calm, you know, doesn't suffer fools. Amazing person to apply prosthetics on. I think Mark found that, because he's just there. He's so professional. And he was very nice to us, and he's got his own vineyards, and he gave us all a nice bottle of wine at the end of the film. He's a great guy. Really fantastic. Oh, and he loves watching. I mean, the makeup call was horrific. 1 o'clock in the morning, there was the makeup call. Then Sam was on set for all day, and then a couple of hours to take off the makeup in the evening. And he was just fantastic. The makeup was being applied because he had to stand there for so many hours. The Jungle Book was fantastic. He did tell us off for singing along, and kept telling us you might have to turn the film off because we were singing King of the Swingers, you know, all that. Anyway.
Sam Neill just gave so much to this movie. The end of the film where he had to be in a full prosthetic suit, which I'm sure Pauline Fowler has told you how long it took to get into that. I mean, he would come to work, I think it was like 3 o'clock in the morning, so that they could spend 7 or 8 hours putting all of this makeup on him, all of these plastic pieces. We'd then shoot with him for about 5 hours and he'd be awake, having the stuff put on, having the stuff taken off, and have to deliver a performance. So he gave so much to the film. And also, incidentally, we were shooting this at Pinewood Studios on the Bond stage in the middle of winter. And the Bond stage is just like a big tin hut. There's no heating in there, and it's freezing cold. And Sam's naked underneath all these little plastic pieces, because he has to be. So he's like freezing his bollocks off as well, in a tremendous discomfort. And all we're doing is like ladling more and more freezing cold blood all over him.
Kathleen Quinlan, who we'd seen in The Doors, that's why we hired her. We thought she was very strong in that. Interestingly, she had a young son in real life, and her character has this child, and she'd had to leave her husband and her child in America to do this film in England, which was echoing her character in the film, who had to go into space to answer this distress call from the Event Horizon, the ship that had disappeared, 20 years earlier. So I think she brought a lot of that real life feeling into her part. I mean, I really, really think you feel for her when she's missing her child and she's feeling guilty about her child, and she very cleverly brought that in there. And I think the cast everybody has something you're guilty about. Everyone has done something horrific, and I think they all tapped into that a little bit. They didn't always tell me what it was, but I'm sure certainly they all had their dark pasts.
Kathleen Quinlan was I love the cast of this movie, so I have nothing but great things to say about them. She was terrific to work with, really so feisty, and I think some of the scariest stuff in the movie is stuff that she was involved in the medical bay.
Peters!
That's what I've learnt is the more movies I've done, really what sells the horror is what you see in somebody's eyes. That's what sells if you're doing a monster movie, that's really what sells the guy in the rubber suit. Is the monster is the person who's reacting to it. Do they really, really look scared? And I think, that's some of my favorite stuff in the movie is where Kathleen's in the medical bay, because she looks genuinely terrified.
Well, Kathleen was a bit of a, although she's hardly older than me at all, but she was a mum, and she felt like a very safe place to go to, Kathleen. She's also a magnificent actress. Because what was weird about Event Horizon is that sometimes from a standing start, people had to go into incredibly extreme emotions because they were being confronted by their worst vision of themselves or whatever, and she'd be standing around chatting and then be completely traumatised, like only a mum could be, there's visions of her child running around. And I just remember being terribly impressed by her. I find it easy to get bound up in the social atmosphere of work and forget that when they say action, you've got to do something extraordinary. And she reminded me all the time.
Jolie Richardson, who I think, her character, as I remember, might have originally been written as a guy. I think Lieutenant Stark was originally a guy. That's one of the things that when I cast, I always like to do, unless it's specific, we'll read both kind of men and women for particular roles, because sometimes it's kind of like fun to flip it around and change it.
Jolie was great. I'd never really done a part like this. Jolie Richardson of the famous Theatrical family So she'd done a lot of sort of more dramatic orientated British films. I don't think she'd done much with guns or stunts, but she got really fit, she really embraced it, and we threw her around a lot. I mean, we just tossed her around. I mean, there's a scene at the end where the ship is breaking up and she's being sucked out and she's hanging on, and we've got, you know, big cannons blasting out air, and she was great, real trooper.
Give me your hand!
Jolie, Jolie would always make me laugh. I don't know why. Jolie, she just makes me laugh. Almost everything she says. I'm not sure she's trying to be funny most of the time either. And she laughed rather too loudly at lots of things I was saying when I really definitely wasn't trying to be funny. I think we got on very well and have remained friendly since. You know, it's much easier to stay friendly with the English people because the Americans you don't see. She, I think, couldn't believe that she was in this science fiction film, and saying some of the stuff to her was so alien. She'd say it and turn around and go, "What am I talking about?" And then it was a rhetorical question, but I would go to the bother of explaining what, you know, various force fields and black hole and worms were, and she'd go, "I don't care."
The antennae array is completely fried. We've got no radio, no laser, no high gain. No one's coming to help us.
She looked damn good in the jumpsuit.
She brought a bit of kind of English class to the picture. I mean, that was one of the things I was very pleased about with the picture, was that Paramount allowed me to cast, you know, a cast that was drawn from around the world. You know, there wasn't an insistence that everyone had to do an American accent. They were fine that Sam Neill's character came from New Zealand, that Fishburne came from America, that Jolie came from England, and everyone could have their little flags on their arm. I mean, and that, I think, gave the movie a flavour that it wouldn't have had otherwise.
Richard Jones, again, extremely handsome, compelling person to watch. You know, he'd not done much outside of America, so I think it was a real adventure for him to come to England. And, you know, the trouble with you have these ensemble casts is they all get their moments, but at the end of the day, it's Lawrence Fishburne and Sam Neill. And it's difficult when you're, you know, to make yourselves presence, to hold your own. But I think Richard really managed it very well. Even though his part wasn't as big as perhaps we would have liked it, he did the same with Sean Pertwee, you know, or Jason Isaacs. They each had their individual characteristics.
Richard T. Jones was a lot of fun to work with. I think this was the first time he'd really been outside of America and done a big studio movie. And he was just so overexcited every single day on set. I actually ran into his wife about 6 months ago at an airport, and she came up to me screaming, and she said, "You know, Richard and I talk about that movie. It's his favorite movie ever." And they just got married at the time, and they got to come and live in London for 6 months. I mean, he was a cool guy to work with. He didn't like being in the wire rigs. That's my memory of Richard, though. Fishburne was fine about it, but Richard just didn't like hanging around in those wire rigs.
Richard T. was he was just this larger-than-life person who came over to London to just suck us all dry of life. He had such a good time when he was here. I can't remember a time when he wasn't laughing. And then he improvised, it seemed to me, all of his lines. He was constantly saying things you think, where the hell did he get? And just because he was so ebullient, in fact, that's what he ends up being in the film. I don't think that was on the page like that. And he was embarrassingly good-looking as well. There was something rather, you know, he was sort of statuesque, beautiful man. I couldn't bear to look at him.
Jack, he was like the mascot of the film, you know, this sweet guy, but great actor. You know, he'd just come off, I think, Breakdown, and again, he'd done a lot of drama, but not a movie like this, but he completely embraced it. He was really like the kind of darling of the cast.
Jack was a lot of fun to work with. He really, he was a good sport, you know, because we did some terrible things to him. You know, we hung him upside down, we stuck blood tubes, you know, around his eyes. He had so much screaming and shouting to do. You know, for all the fact that he's, you know, a bit of an icon in horror films because of his performance in Event Horizon, the guy has the most amazing singing voice and actually started out in musical theatre. So I remember I had my birthday during the shoot, and And he sung this song at my birthday. It was just fantastic. He has an amazing voice. Someone should make a musical with him. Event Horizon, the musical.
Mr. Isaacs, who has done virtually every film we've made, you know, scary. He just became a very scary doctor on the ship. And some of the stuff that we had to cut was his stuff. I mean, we built this huge prosthetic of him. And he's skinned alive, and he's hanging from the ceiling in the medical center of the ship, and he's basically dead, but he lifts his head up and he speaks, and Jason just loved all this gory stuff. I mean, he really embraced it and had a great time. And I love the scene where he where they got the recording and they're trying to work out what it is, and of course Jason says, "Oh, it's in Latin."
Sounds like Liberate me something. I don't know. I can't make out the rest.
Liberate me.
Save me.
Which is a little bit of an on-the-nose beat, but he does it so well, you know, we get away with it. He's great. We love him.
I know Paul and Jeremy from a long time ago, the director and producer, and Jeremy Bolton and I were at university together, and when I was doing a play, I was doing Angels in America at the National Theatre, and he came to me and said, "I want you to meet a friend of mine who's directing a film. You haven't got any time to be in it, so all we can do is get you half a day, like 3 or 4 lines." And I said, "Well, I don't want to be snobby, but I think I should be, you know, playing bigger parts than that." He said, "He's a really great guy, you'll like him." And it was shopping, and the director was Paul, and we hit it off, and next time he made a movie, he came to me and asked me to be in it.
Jason and I became good friends on this movie, and we've pretty much worked together ever since. He's appeared in nearly all of my movies in one form or another, sometimes as like an uncredited cameo. You know, very serious. I had to persuade him to do the movie. He didn't immediately jump at the idea. I thought he brought an awful lot to his character. There wasn't an awful lot on the page, and he definitely brought a lot. You know, a lot of the character traits and quirks are all Jason's invention.
When I first read the script, I think I had the same reaction that most people have when they read horror film scripts, which is, I don't really get it. And it was only Paul explaining his vision to me that made it come to life, because you don't jump when you read something on a page, and you don't get a feeling of dread, and all those things come from storytelling. And more than most genres, I think, a horror film, science fiction horror film like this is in the director's hands. So I read it and thought, I wonder what the hell this is going to be like.
Shit. Do you understand? It's just a big hunk of metal. There's nothing odd going on.
DJ?
Well, I was playing a doctor, and my brother's doctor, and he's this very, professionally, he's this very grim man, very taciturn, and people are always leaning forward to hear what the hell he's talking about. And so, because DJ didn't say very much, I thought I'd be this incredibly serious or grave personality, and that worked because then Lawrence started flipping off me and making jokes about, you know, he kind of made fun of me as soon as I introduced myself and did it other times, but it made me also, I felt like I was maybe the rock that people came to confess. So basically I played my brother. The other thing I wanted to do was have gadgets. Since I was in a science fiction film, and maybe I wouldn't be in another one, I wanted to have things about me, and I always fancied when I was a kid having a bat utility belt. And so I asked Paul if I could have a utility waistcoat, and I got this coat with, you know, billions of strange-looking implements in them. God only knows what they were meant to do, and I tried to use them in various scenes, but mostly they look rather cool, I hope. I thought so anyway.
If you watch the movie, he's got so many props, knives and belts and things and because he really got into that. And then about halfway through the movie, when he's realizing it's one thing to get all these props, but then you have to deal with them all the way through the film, he's like, "Paul, why did you allow me to have all these fucking props? You know, I've got all these things, syringes," and so that became the bane of his life, is how to deal with all of this stuff.
Paul's an incredibly collaborative guy, and he threw it open to all of us. I mean, it became much more like doing a play, really, because we went to the same set every day for a very long time, which you don't normally do on movies, because there were no locations, there were no extras ever in space. You know, nobody wanders by the window outside. We became a very tight ensemble company, and we all made contributions all the time. Mostly we made contributions to our own characters, but sometimes you make suggestions for other people, and Paul was always up for it. For instance, you know, one of the things that we all did was come up with a kind of background and history for our characters, so they seemed like they had a full life. And I was very aware that in the story, a number of the characters have, not flashbacks, have kind of nightmare visions of whatever this ship that's been to hell does to them, and I wasn't going to get one. So I wondered, maybe they happened, but they didn't happen on screen. And for me, DJ had a vision of getting his chest ripped open because he had an operation when he was a kid. And so I gave myself a huge scar from neck to navel, and we put it on every morning. It took forever, and I don't think the audience ever got it or saw it, but I was rubbing it often in the scenes. And sure enough, when he meets his fate, DJ, he gets split open.
Sean Pertwee had the most amazing haircut done for this movie. He had his hair bleached, cut about that short, and then just bleached bottle blonde, and it was like shocking platinum blonde. It's fantastic. He looked so over the top, and he came in and he said, "What do you think of the hair for the movie, Paul?" And I just looked at him, I was shocked, and he went, "Okay, I understand." And then when he came back, like half a day later, he'd had it all shaved off, and that's where his look came from. And for me, I think it's his finest performance that I've seen him deliver. I mean, he was really damn good in the movie.
Sean, who you know, did shopping with us. He's a real lad. He's a real friend. He was like the sexy, young, fun guy. He brought in some humour. He had a great time. I mean, Sean, who loves movies like this and loves video games and loves gadgets, he was just constantly playing on the set. He was great.
Sean Pertwee and I go back to when we were teenagers, and it was just so lovely to work with him again. I've done it 3 times now, all in Paul Anderson's films. The first one was in Shopping, where I went and did just a few hours on the set really to meet Paul, but it was with Sean, who I'd known since he was at the Bristol Old Vic and I was at university there. And I remember getting there and going, "Well, what should we do about this?" And he lifted up the script, threw it away. He said, "No, it's Paul. It's all right. We can do whatever we like." And we basically improvised the whole scene. And he hasn't changed since we were 18, actually, 19, not at all. I guess we probably look older, but I look at him, he doesn't look any older to me. It was really lovely to be people you hang around with, to go to work with them as well makes it a bonus, because you don't have to start getting funny about your territory.
The shoot took around about 80 odd days. I think 86 days. And we shot over Christmas. We were shooting all the really strange stuff involving maggots and all the visions of hell, these orgiastic visions of hell. That was all done second unit, but Paul directed it and oversaw it as well on the weekends. So if you added in that, probably you would be nearer 90 days. But the main unit was about 80 to 86 days.
I think emotionally, some of the scenes that were more challenging was a lot of the kind of hell stuff. It was kind of disturbing for the actors, I know. And these are fragments in the movie. I mean, really, they're only shots that are in the film for frames, but I think they're very memorable. And we went into great detail to shoot them. I mean, I always pictured those scenes from hell as having a very painterly quality, that they should be like Bosch, or they should be like Bruegel, or they should have the painterly feeling of photographs, like Wittgen's photographs. And that meant we just took a long time to shoot them, and we kind of set them up like they were kind of mini photo shoots. It was kind of disturbing places for the actors to go. We kind of made working on the set feel a bit, it was difficult. It made it quite high pressure because they just didn't come to work feeling particularly good about the day's work ahead of them. I mean, everyone got on, but when you come to make a light romantic comedy and you've got a fun scene ahead of you, that's one thing. When you've come to film a vision from hell and you're going to have guts spilling out of your mouth and you're going to have blood pouring down your face, and this is an image of you that's going to be out there, for the rest of your career, the actors found it disturbing. That didn't stop us making them do it, of course.
All the zero gravity stuff was really tough. We made a decision in the first week of filming, because in the original script, they were in zero gravity for virtually the whole time on the ship. And Paul and I realized this was never going to work. We'd never finish the schedule. It would just look silly, be too much of a good thing. So we introduced magnetic boots. They're always very handy, magnetic boots. So they go down the corridor, and there's a great shot. We go, doom, doom.
Magnetic boots on.
So simple. And that basically, I mean, kept us on budget and on schedule, and I think it works perfectly well. So the zero gravity sequences were very tough.
They were so slow to shoot. The wire work was very complicated. It was very uncomfortable for the actors. And it required a huge amount of planning. What we would do is we built large models of the set and then had little miniature spacemen. And then with a lipstick camera, we would shoot the miniature spacemen in the miniature model and try and get the angles that we wanted. And then we would cut a sequence with that Videomatic before we even tried to shoot a frame of film. And the reason for that is it's so slow when you're shooting wire work that you just can't make it up on the day. You have to be very precise about which angles you want. And also you just can't have the actors in the wires for too long. The scene where Fish saves Jack Noseworthy and pushes him back into the airlock, for example, the way we achieved that was when he pushes him back into the airlock, we actually built the airlock upright. So what should have been the door, which would have been at the side of the set, was actually pointing towards the ceiling. So to get them flying in, we were actually dropping Fish from the roof, so he's hanging by his ankles. And of course, that's an incredibly, it's a really unpleasant position to be in. All the blood rushes to your head. And then it would take, obviously, forever to get Fish into the suit. So by the time we got him in the suit, he'd already been hanging upside down for a couple of minutes. You can't have someone turned upside down for too long. So you'd have to, once you got everyone in position, you'd have to go very quickly for a take, and then it would take a long time to reset it. So the wire work was probably the biggest challenge technically.
One of the, well, we set fire to a stage at Pinewood. We burnt down, I think it was stage 7. When you first go onto the Event Horizon, there's a long corridor, and it's we put a mirror. We got this mirror over from France that gave the impression the corridor went on and on like into infinity. And we had a special effects shoots going on one day, and we had this. There's a big explosion at the end of the movie. Fishburne is running down the corridor. The ship's breaking up. We wanted to actually have some real flame elements, so we had a special effects shoot, and the special effects guy also had a wind machine, and the flames went onto the silk cloth that was wrapped into the set, and the whole thing just went up literally in about a minute. The whole stage just and that was an interesting day to explain to Pinewood. But I think I mean, that was really the only bad thing that happened. The set in which there is the giant orb spinning, that was a huge set to build. That took about 4 months. We had masses of scaffolding. I think, the thing about Paul, most of Paul's films, everything's big. So, it may look like a small idea on the page, but it just goes big. And the challenge as his producer is to try to give him the bigness, but keep it on budget. That was a real challenge on that film. It was very complicated.
Yeah, I did do some stunts. I did. Sam threw me about a lot at some point. Well, when he kills me, I suppose. People who are watching this have probably already seen the story. Yeah, Sam threw me about, and I was flying all over the place. I'm always keen to show what a good egg I am, and get involved. But I remember coming home and barely being able to move, being covered in bruises, little cuts, and everything. But the thing that was most, disturbing about doing the film was the body they made. They made a complete body cast of me that they hung up and gutted and ripped all my entrails out. And it was an absolutely perfect facsimile of me. And a lot of people think that was me hung up on hooks. I don't know how they think I did my rib cage being open, but I remember asking for the body at the end, saying, "Can I have that?" Yeah. It was perfect. I mean, I looked at it and thought it was me. And they said, "No, we need it. We might get to use it again." I went, "Where is anyone going to use a life-size model of me with my entrails pouring out?" But if anyone spots it anyway, send me a postcard, I'll buy it off them.
Bob Keane did a lot of the prosthetics. He specifically did prosthetics that involve building bodies. So there's a sequence in which a man is frozen, is suspended and frozen, and then he cracks and he falls to the ground as the gravity is put back on. And he did a great job. He did the scene in which Jason Isaacs' character is skinned alive. He did that body cast. So he did all of the body molds, and Pauline did more of the specific makeup effects. So the maggots on the little boy's legs, that was more of her stuff. It was interesting to have two such brilliant people working together. The reason we did it was because just the amount of work. We thought that one person just couldn't handle it in one department. So that's why we mixed it up. I mean, poor Bob, there is a story which is true, but when the man cracks and falls to the ground, someone had actually, presumably the guy who made it, had put a doll, plastic doll, into this body. And if you look closely, now poor Bob, I don't know who did this to him, some embittered employee, but you know, that was weird.
The thing about special effects is, you know, when you're doing a love scene with someone who's got really bad breath and you don't like them, that's a special effect, you're pretending. When you're meant to burn your lips on a cup of coffee, but actually they're serving you cold Coca-Cola, it's a special effect. So the fact that you're meant to pretend that a planet's about to hit you in the face, or you're levitating, or, you know, whatever, you see visions of your ancestors grinding each other into meat, or whatever the things are that happen in those flash frames, it really, it's all the same. There's no difference between normal acting in a normal room and when something's blue screen or when they put it on later, because none of it's really happening. So I think more is made of special effects from an actor's point of view than is necessary. The only thing that's really hard is if there isn't another character there when you're meant to be talking to someone, which does occasionally happen, but I don't think it happened in this film.
The reason I got involved in Event Horizon, we'd done as a company, we'd worked on quite a few films, and we heard about this film that was coming out. It sounded fantastic, you know, youngsters, it's all sci-fi with a nice cast. We went up, met Paul Anderson, the director. Luckily we got on well with him, and that was it. It was fantastic, it was really good. He was terrific, you know, lots of ideas, we put in our ideas. Couldn't ask for anything else.
I became involved in Event Horizon when I was contacted by Paul Anderson, and he had a script at that point, but not a lot else. And it was very loose, the script at that point. And we had a meeting, we got together and had a meeting, and it was a kind of, I think he'd seen Hellraiser and spoken to Clive about a couple of things. And he was enthusiastic for us to get involved in some of the more deaths and some of the more complicated gigs on it. So we got on very well, hit it off well. And then we started, the script, there was as I remember, there was quite a gap then. And then the script suddenly came back and everything was suddenly going. So it was a sort of, from a long time talking about it, we were then suddenly involved in shooting and it was all systems go.
We had a brief from Paul Anderson our main one was to construct something or give the image of Sam Neill when he becomes, it's hard to describe because everyone calls it the Werebeast, but I'm not sure that was ever the right name. I know everyone calls it that, but it was more the dark side of Sam, really. He had to have carved things into his face that we don't understand, into his whole body. And I think that was just the bad bit of Sam coming out. He was taken over, who knows, he's the devil. No one's ever understood, but we had to give a visual.
Prosthetics are really what you stick onto an actor. So it's a thin appliance. You take the life cast of the actor's face, and then you'd sculpt on top of that an appliance that would be stuck on top. That's called a prosthetic. It really comes from a war term from World War II, or World War I, in fact, which was where they had to make fake noses and things like that when people got blown away. So that became a prosthetic, and it's grown out of that.
Well, when we start designing a full body prosthetic and designing a character like the Werebeast, for a start, we have to take on board Paul, or the director Paul Anderson's ideas, and Sam Neill, the actor, who of course is such an important guy. You know, he knows what he wants as well. You get a combination of what they feel the character should look like, and then you design You do a series of maquettes, a series of images. I mean, Paul very strongly knew that Sam had to incise these sigils and marks and runes over his face, carve them into his flesh. Great idea. And he didn't want to see seams, and he didn't want to see edges. This had to be believable, close up, really tight as flesh on this guy's face with just these marks. So we start off and we sculpt a whole load of different maquettes. Prefer not to do drawings. Drawings 2D, you can do a quick sketch, but until you can see something in a three-dimensional form, then everyone can walk around and go, oh yeah, that's cool, that looks nice at this angle. So we do a load of maquettes first, and then we start into the major process of life casting and sculpting.
The scene in which he's in the chamber and his veins are literally popping out of his arm, that was horrific to shoot. That was really complicated to make that realistic, and we shot a lot of it in camera with makeup, and then we CG enhanced it, which is why I think it's quite an effective sequence.
Oh my God. Animatronics are completely different to prosthetics. What they are is when you don't have an actor involved and you have a mechanical puppet or a mechanical device inside something that's usually inanimate, which then has to be controlled from the outside, either by radio control or cables or pneumatics or things like that. We had quite a few animatronics in Event Horizon. We had the Burning Man, so underneath all that, he was a bit like a rod puppet, which all burnt. And we also had a really cool animatronic for where one of the leads falls and slams down, which had a little kicking motion and everything else in it. So animatronics are when you don't have people inside. Prosthetics are when you've got actors inside them.
So we're doing a full body, when we're dealing with head to foot prosthetics. First of all, it's a full body life cast in separate sections. So we do the head first, because the head is going to have to be worked on many times in the future, you know, for the close-up facial prosthetics. Then, depending on the body position, standing, you do the body you might do separate arms, you might do the torso separately from the waist down to the legs, and all these components. It can take up to 6-7 hours for body cast sections, which is crippling for the actor and for the people who are working on it. So you get plaster positives out. So you've got Sam Neill in pure white plaster. And then it's lots of moulds, lots of different sections that we can cast, we can work on, sculpt, remold. Process is endless.
There was a lot of scenes that from the film that required prosthetics. There were, for us, one of the major ones was a big nightmare sequence, which is the videotapes that reflected back to the people who were the original crew, and there was a lot of prosthetics in that. Sometimes it was you got blood and guts gore with insides torn out and eyeballs missing and severed limbs and all that kind of stuff. There was also some complicated prosthetics on the character that gets frozen when he tries to commit suicide by opening the outer hatch, and he actually ends up tumbling outside and freezing up. There was a lot of complicated prosthetics on that, which had to. Some of them were on the wrists, which had to bubble up, but also we had complicated prosthetics on the face that were all had to crack and revealed the cracks underneath. Quite a lot of different. I'm trying to think what else there was on it. The prosthetics. Lots of blood and guts. I mean, there was just lots of your normal guts and gag like that, and tons of blood. I mean, there was so much blood. But I think probably for a 30-second sequence, that was the sort of montage of stuff that takes place in the video that they watch. There was a week's shooting and probably about 4 or 5 weeks worth of prep, just all the different gags and everything else.
We worked on a lot of other scenes. Jason Isaacs was disemboweled beautifully, we felt. That was quite a religious scene, that, you know, with the old arms outstretched. And I'm not quite sure if you saw all the beautiful guts that we made lying on the table in front of him, but they were gorgeous, and all the flesh was backlit. I mean, Jason Isaacs is awesome as well. I mean, he had another full body life cast, and in a crippling position. He was standing there and he was refusing, and his arms were shaking, but he did it. I mean, he gritted his teeth, he wouldn't give up. He's a fantastic guy.
What you have is a set of teeth which the actor would have worn, and they operate it with their tongue underneath. But this was for someone was like knocking a hammer into the back of someone's head, and then we had to have the tooth being knocked out, blood and guts, everything else. Tiny gag. You know, there's a few days' work in just that alone, and it's probably on the screen for less than 2 seconds, 3 seconds. So there was tons of those little tiny gags, which really made up that prosthetic side of things, and really gave moments. But I think it's how they use those moments that count. It may only be 2 seconds, but when they're coming at you, it really does sort of pound the senses. The animatronic side of the film was more to do with things like we had to have a release mechanism for the frozen man to bring it down to actually drop it at exactly the right angle. Paul wanted it to be like a chimney collapsing, so it had to come into the ground and then completely crunch up as it went. So that needed a rig to drop that. There was a burning man, which was an optical technique, which was really sort of something that pushed out the limits a little bit, which was to do with us doing a rod puppet with layers of burning layers, which they'd use for matting and optically put on. So that was another animatronic. And there was the falling rig, which was a great rig for one of the characters had to fall from the top of a really high site and then fall down and smash into the floor. And that was done with an animatronic dummy as well. But I think by far the most complex effect in the film was probably the Burning Man, because it was made up of so many different layers and so many different techniques. When we finished with it, we were supplying optical elements for them to use later on, but we had to have a material that would burn and deteriorate like flesh and burn onto the next layer and could be done over and over again. I think we shot that for about 8-9 days, that sequence of the optical elements of that. So incredibly complex piece just by itself. Event Horizon had lots of complicated effects because we were trying to push the envelope and really reach out there and get something that the audience hadn't seen before, and something that would really take us to a different place. So I think we were always trying to be very complex effects, very difficult effects, and something you hadn't seen. And I think that's always the hardest effects you can try and do.
Just before Event Horizon started, I was running a company in Los Angeles, and Richard Jurisic was one of our clients. And when Richard became involved in Event Horizon, he knew me well enough to ask me to come back to London with him to be the visual effects producer. The work that I was doing at that time was very much just in the post-production end of things, and so I saw this as a good opportunity to get involved in a film from start right through to the finish. We went over to Pinewood in August, and the film took almost an entire year to complete from when we started through to when it was released. Richard brought over some other key members of the team from Los Angeles as well, and then we did a lot of local hire for the crew, and we took it from there.
Yeah, there are some specialties involved in the film because we're doing an explosion, explosions that wouldn't be traditional explosions. We have to photograph like many elements, the scale and the scope of the ship. We have a ship that's intended to be a mile long, so you have to always show that in a big, wide master. Well, when you go in to do a close-up and the ship is needed in so many backgrounds and so many pieces, you're talking about how do you scale that down? So we've got a 240th scaled big ship that's 30 feet long. It takes a giant forklift to move it. So our miniatures are really big. We have to put these explosions together in elements. So people. That's not done that often. I mean, it's done an awful lot from where I came from. But so we brought people along that were used to that, so we could just get into it. And the support we've got and the technicians and the artists and the artisans here has been real good. But our explosion, for example, will have like 8 or 9 elements. I hate to talk numbers and elements, but they had to be done in pieces so they could be reduced and then put together. So there's graphics, explosions, real-size miniatures. So that's the unique part. It's the digital services available here also to put it together are necessary.
To begin with, really, there was quite an open brief. Paul had certain sequences in the script that he wanted us to work on storyboarding. Richard brought over a very talented storyboard artist called Brent Boates, who worked very specifically on the visual effects sequences, although Paul would continually steal him to storyboard other sequences in the film. And really, between Richard, Paul, and Brent Boates, they came up with the main effect sequences, the main shots that were involved. Paul was very good because he actually put a lot of trust in Richard Jurisic to really come up with a lot of the ideas about how things were to be done. Richard's background in visual effects goes all the way back to 2001. And a lot of the people in the effects community, if you get a list of the films that made them want to work in visual effects, Richard has worked on a lot of them, things like Blade Runner, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, a lot of work with Douglas Trumbull on Brainstorm and Silent Running. And to have someone of Richard's caliber as visual effects supervisor on this film was really quite a coup for Paul to pull off. And I think when you pull in someone of Richard's caliber, you give them pretty free rein to come up with cool stuff. So really from that it was Richard and Paul coming up with these amazing ideas for shots, to begin with without much regard as to how they were actually going to be accomplished. And then once that was done, Richard sat down to try and figure out how the shots were going to be made.
Well, you know, the techniques, there are many techniques, and we're really not doing anything that the people before us, all the great guys before us, hadn't done before. There's always a new precedent-setting thing that comes up once in a while, and usually it's an accident. Sometimes you have to design it. But what you really have to do is you take a look at the script and you reconfigure all those old techniques and pieces of equipment to what's needed for the script. Because you could fall into a trap where you take something necessary in the story and reconfigure it to fit a piece of equipment you have. That's the danger, so you have to resist that, you know. What you do is you try to do you have a bundle of money, a certain amount of money. Everybody agrees on it. It's established from before, and you try to get the director what the director wants and the vision and the needs of the script done for that amount of money.
Most of the scenes required some kind of digital help. In all, there are about 400 or so shots in the film that went through the computer. Some of the work was very straightforward. It was just wire or rig removal. Every screen in the film where there's a bit of animation going on was all put in afterwards. There was no on-set playback. And that in itself was quite a huge volume of shots. And then beyond that, there were the obvious special effects shots, a lot of the spaceship work, which was planned right from the start. A lot of the coolant in Zero Gravity and the other Zero Gravity gags. But in all, about 400 shots. Many of those came up just through the post-production process where Paul would decide he wanted to use a certain shot in a different way, and we had to kind of put that together and deal with it.
In this film, in Event Horizon, there are 6 of the sets, major sets, that will be finished in visual effects, and hopefully there'll be hidden visual effects. You won't notice that the set isn't 150 feet long, it's only 30 feet long, and we're trying to make it 100 feet long.
The hero effects shots on Event Horizon we worked on for almost a full year. We started doing some of the initial pre-visualization and planning work before the main unit photography started. And a lot of the shots that were very complicated were delivered right at the last minute, just a couple of weeks before the film was due out. Generally, the way the process worked is that Richard, Paul, and Brent Boates would sit down and do some initial sketches and storyboards. And then what Richard had done was a little bit unusual. He had scale models built out of foam core and erected on one of the stages at Pinewood. And then he and Paul, with a small lipstick camera, actually shot all of the angles that Paul wanted to use and experimented with some camera moves that might end up in the finished film. From a lot of that footage, they then went back and re-storyboarded the sequences and worked out really what angles and what shots they wanted. Separately from that, Richard then went away to figure out how feasible it was to achieve many of those shots, what size the models would have to be, how big a stage we needed to erect a lot of the final models on, and what type of motion control equipment we would require to capture the elements that would then be put together in post. The model elements themselves were shot in parallel with the main unit photography, so that Paul was able to review what was being done in the shots at the same time that he was filming with the actors. We turned over a lot of the model elements to the visual effects facilities in order that they could actually start work on some of the more complicated shots while we were still filming. And that worked very well. The two main facilities that were involved in London were CineSight and Computer Film Company. CineSight were involved in putting together a lot of the spaceship shots and a lot of the zero gravity gags, whereas Computer Film Company were involved in doing all of the screen inserts and all of the shots where the coolant is seen floating in the air. We swapped a lot of the shots around from the two facilities, really depending on how big their workload was in terms of putting the shots together. Paul, of course, in his own inimitable fashion, did manage to throw us a couple of curveballs and come up with some shots spontaneously that we had to respond to. But that's generally taken as being part of the creative process, and I think makes the film a lot better.
Well, Paul's really into visual effects. He understands just about everything they do on the stage. If he's a young man, and if he hasn't seen it before, he learns it first. He knows it before anybody, which is quite good, and really good for us, because I was joking when I said the hardest part, or what's been most difficult, is keeping up with Paul. That, of course, is all directors want as much as they can, and Paul does. If they didn't, they wouldn't be worth too much. But the fact that he's so knowledgeable about doing this and so interested in visuals does give us the time. We don't have to be on the stage at all times to check a plate. I can leave with confidence and know that the plate's going to be okay. Doesn't happen too often.
Overall, there were about 400 effects shots that we worked on digitally. Of those, probably about half of them were pretty straightforward. All of the screens where you see animation or live action happening were all put in after the event. On set, they were just put in with green screen, and then afterwards Computer Film Company tracked and then laid in graphics which were supplied by AMX Digital, who also designed all of the transparencies where they were putting into screens but they weren't actually moving.
I knew the director needed a fireball chasing our hero, Lawrence Fishburne, down the rotating set. It's kind of a unique set. It's very hard to walk into that set, incidentally. He did well running down because the equilibrium, it really messes with you. So he practiced. It's not easy. What was intended was a flame bar, and a flame to chase him and get close to him. Well, doing it for real, everybody tends to take a long focal length lens and compress the action. When I saw the rotating set, I suggested that if we could rotate it faster, we can shoot an actual flame ball down in a second pass and shoot it at a slower rate of frame rate, with the tunnel rotating twice as fast, 8 RPM, instead of 4 RPM when he was running. Then the two should just marry up real easily, and we got lucky, and they did. Neil Corbold, Physical Effects, who has a hydraulic system rotating that massive set, and Mark Weingartner could time the set, so we actually had a rotation tachometer on the set.
There was also an awful lot of wire and rig work done to actually remove things from set that Paul didn't want in. A lot of the zero gravity stunts involved quite large armatures moving things through shot that we then digitally removed. There were also a fair number of shots where props were created digitally and put into scenes to make it appear as if they're in zero gravity. The two shots that stand out are the first shot on the Event Horizon inside the main corridor, where there's a large broken water bottle floating around and some other objects. If you look closely, there's a CG book that floats through shots that actually has a picture of Paul Anderson on the front cover, which was his little Hitchcock cameo. The other sequences that I think worked particularly well for computer-generated props were the glove sequence where Miller is first exploring in the Event Horizon. The main effects work that we had planned right from the start were a lot of the big spaceship shots and also the liquid coolant. I would think in all there were probably about 100 people involved in the different facilities we were using. Certainly for Computer Film Company and CineSight, while they were working on it, during the post-production period, it was the biggest shows that they were doing. Often they had people on set when we were shooting elements or we were shooting principal photography that they were then going to add things to. They were a core team working right from the start, because we knew that the effects work we were doing was so complicated that unless we actually had the artists involved right from the pre-production, the planning stage, then it would be much more difficult to put together. And it's a credit as much to those companies that the work looks as good as it does.
You let me burn!
Well, the technique is a flamethrower device, and to make it reach the length of the tunnel, there was difficulty to get it go down through the tunnel because the fire will chase the air, the oxygen. It wants oxygen to burn. So that set, if you noticed, as it was rotating, had holes in it and little fans and fins. So there's a lot of oxygen. So it's sitting there ready like a dragon. When the flame comes and catches it, it joins it and comes as a thrust. So we shoot it in slow motion at the frame rate described for the man running. When we used the long lens and tightened his action down, the set was rotating at 4 RPM, and we photographed the set now with the flame at 12 RPM and 3 times the amount of film. So that again, when you laid them down in registration, it would fit the set. We could also place the fire as close to him as we wanted, what was needed for the film, to make it look as though it gained on him, because we could do the different speeds. It's just a little trick. After the fireball chases him down the tunnel, he dives through and saves the day. Ha-ha. No, he doesn't. The flame comes through the door. We don't know what's happening yet. And it takes on the shape of a man. We call him the Burning Man in this film. And he's quite a character. He has to burn. So we haven't developed him totally. We have all the pieces ready to put together. This piece here, the feet, we call those the crispy feet. This is the crispy feet walk through this tank of water. In the scene, in the set, you'll notice there was some water behind. For some reason, the crispy man strikes Lawrence, knocks him into the water, and then he walks in afterwards. So to show that he's in the water, we have a cut on his feet. And again, the director, Paul, and I talked and thought it was cool. Paul wanted him to walk in there, and he gave us the okay to try and have him burning, and it required the robot. So we have a robot here in motion control with the camera that's following him, and we've got him walking towards the camera as though he's the real man. So we've shot actually 7 or 8 elements here. We've got him walking with steam coming out of his legs. We've got him walking crispy. We've got him walking with black legs on flame. We've got him walking in and out of the water in different frame rates. Every one of those, again, come on top of each other. So selectively, we'll have to edit and select certain flames. Then when we put it together, we'll have to hide our flaws by maybe using some computer-generated flames or some other pieces. But the end result, we hope, is him walking in the water. It's been accepted. The timing and the movement is nice. But we hope to see into the water, because he's the Burning Man. He's going to burn everywhere. So he's going to burn underwater.
I think the single shot that stands out as being the most complicated and also one of the most effective is what we call the daylight station pullback, which is Sam Neill opening the shutters at his, on his apartment, and then the camera pulling back through this enormous space station gantry work and revealing the Earth below. And that was an incredibly complicated shot to plan and to actually execute. And that was really the first shot that we did and the last shot that was actually delivered. And I think even looking at it now, there are still 1 or 2 things that we'd like to go back and continue working on. The reason it was so complicated is that we had to build a number of different scales of the same miniature. And it's a huge credit to David Sharp that he was able to do this and then replicate the camera move through it all. David Sharp and David Stewart, who was the motion control cameraman, worked on planning out exactly how the move was going to work. And with Richard, managed to pre-visualize it in such a way that after we'd shot the individual elements and turned them over, CineSight were able to very quickly put it together and make sure that it worked, and then actually start work on the shot towards final. Certainly when we looked at even the dailies, it was a very disorienting piece of work to look at. And it was so complex that I think even with Richard explaining how it was going to work, no one actually believed him that it would work. And it's quite amazing now how effective it is in the film.
What you try to do is blend all of your shots in the best you can with the assets that you have at hand, so that it becomes a continuum of experience. We've got, I can't really focus on what it is because there's so much. We've got so many things to do. We are part, really, the visual effects. I wouldn't call this a visual effects film. It's just film. It's part of the filmmaking that we're going to require visual effects. It's probably one of the best examples to date of a film that couldn't be done without the visuals, because nobody has a stage large enough to build the 800-foot spaceship in. So we have to trick the audience when we can. And Paul's real clever, and he has a cut or two. We established that the scope and the size of the ship, and hopefully it'll go past and no one will think that it was done in visuals.
In terms of which sequence I'm most proud of, the opening shot of the Event Horizon, when the camera rakes in across it and the sunlight filters through the gantry work, I think visually is one of the best shots. In fact, though, I think the most impressive work is a lot of the effects shots that perhaps the audience wouldn't notice or wouldn't be sure whether it was shot for real or CG. I particularly like a very short sequence when Miller is first exploring the Event Horizon and is startled by the CG glove. I think a lot of the lighting in that, which was done in CG, works very, very well. And likewise, when they're first in the main corridor and there's a camera shot with the water bottle that's been shattered and there are little bits of ice hanging in the air, and the torchlight that comes up through that. Those are the kind of details, I think, that really make a huge difference into how well the computer-generated objects are integrated into live action.
This place is a tomb.
First of all, we had an extremely tight post-production schedule. The movie was green-lit based upon being in the theatres by a certain date. So our post-production schedule was less than 6 months, which on a film of this magnitude in terms of visual effects is a very dangerous thing. So we went to our first test and we had a lot of horrific, gory sequences in there. The maggots around the legs, JD being skinned alive. And what we found was the audience just couldn't, it was just too much. It undermined the drama. Now, they were also watching a film that did not have complete visual effects. Because the schedule was so tough, we couldn't test it with a complete bunch of visual effects. We then cut those sequences out of the film. We also changed the ending a number of times, and that was the film that was released.
We cut a lot of scenes from the final version of the film, partly because we had a very difficult post-production period on the movie. The post-production period was always going to be short, but as a director you have a guaranteed 10-week director's cut, which is guaranteed by the Directors Guild of America. But you can waive that if the studio put enough pressure on you, and this was one of the cases where the studio, they wanted the movie, they were desperate to release the movie, they were excited about it. They were saying all the right things to me, so I said, kind of in my naivety, that I would shorten the director's cut from 10 weeks to 6 weeks. And then what happened was, because I was also directing the second unit, we continued to shoot wire work and zero gravity work. After the main unit wrapped, I shot for another 2 weeks with the second unit. So officially, my director's cut had been going on for 2 weeks, even though I was still on the stage shooting. So when it came down to it, I really only had 4 weeks to assemble the movie before we showed it to the studio. And then they also had the idea that the first time they would see the film, we would also do an audience test screening. So 4 weeks to assemble a movie as complicated as Event, with all the visual effects, with all the kind of hell sequences that had to be very finely cut, because it's those visions of hell are lots of 2, 1, 3 frame cuts, which take forever. It was a huge amount of work to do in 4 weeks, and frankly, we didn't manage to do it. So the movie was overly long, and it wasn't in great shape. Some of the scenes weren't polished very well. There was bits of bad performance, there was bits of bad direction. All those things that you normally take out into 10 weeks, we didn't have time to do in 4 weeks. And added to which, we had to test in America. So we had to fly the movie over there because we were doing post in London. And we mixed the sound for the film the night before we flew to America. And the mixing studio we were in, basically broke down. So we couldn't finish the sound mix properly. So we went there with a movie that was, wasn't edited properly. The sound mix was bad. And in a horror movie, I mean, it's the classic thing, but if you turn the volume down on any scary movie, it's not scary anymore. I mean, you can sit through any scary scene, and if you don't have the music and you don't have the sound effects and you don't have the build, it just doesn't frighten you. So all of those things conspired to mean that the first test screening we had of Event was just disastrous. It didn't go well at all. And in that situation, I think the studio reaction is always, when you have a movie that doesn't really work, the first instinct is to push the filmmakers to cut the film down, make it shorter, make it faster, just get it over with, so the audience don't have to sit through. I think the first cut was just over 2 hours. It was 2 hours and 10 minutes. And they were like, you have to take half an hour out of it. It's got to be shorter, and we did that. It was really my first studio film that I'd done where we'd had a bad test. Mortal Kombat, we had good tests on. The audience really liked it. This was the first time I'd kind of walked into a room of 350 people. They watched the movie, and at the end, they just didn't like it. Or some people liked it passionately, but not enough. So we cut the film, and I think again, because we're on a very tight post-production period, we had to go back to America a week later and test the movie again. And if you only have a week, it's very hard to make rational, well-thought-out decisions. So I think we went from one end of the spectrum where the movie was too long, undoubtedly, and then we cut it, and then I think it became too short. And then the release of the film was looming, and we ended up releasing that version of the movie. And I think that was a big mistake, because I felt there were definitely very good scenes that weren't quite reaching their potential, but could have done if we'd had more time to work on them. But because the studio were adamant on releasing the movie on a certain date, we just never had time to really fix the film. And the scenes we cut out were primarily as well related to kind of the visions of hell, the experiences that the crew of the Lewis and Clark had on the Event Horizon. And there was a terrific sequence that Andrew Kevin Walker wrote, who wrote Seven, and he came in at one point to do a polish on the screenplay. And he wrote this great sequence where the crew of the Lewis and Clark have just come through the airlock in the Event Horizon the first time, and they see everything floating in zero gravity. They see ice crystals, they see a wrench floating, they see a watch floating. And then Fishburne sees something, and he walks up to it. And it was framed, so he didn't quite know how big it was, because whatever it was in the foreground, and he was in the background. So he thought it was something quite big. But as he got closer and closer, he realized it was something quite small, until eventually he could get it in his fingers like that. And what you realized was, and Sam Neill and Jolie were looking at it on the monitors, and Jason Isaacs were looking at it, trying to see what it was, and it was a tooth that had been ripped out by the root. So you had the tooth, you had the whole root of the tooth, and you had a bit of gum attached to it as well. So it's just like someone had ripped it out with a pair of pliers. And it was a truly disturbing image. But it took a long time to play that scene out. And it was one of the scenes that kind of bit the dust, and I was always very sorry about that. Because did it progress the plot at all? No, it didn't. And that's the reason why it came out as well, because the pressure was make the film shorter, get on with it. And it didn't progress the plot, which was the studio's reasoning for taking it out. For me, though, it was truly disturbing, and it kind of informed their exploration of the event, and I think would have unsettled the audience even more. Although, in retrospect, the audience was so unsettled anyway. They were terrified when our heroes were exploring the Event Horizon. But I feel that scene was one that we lost, that I always wanted to put back in again.
Paul and I personally feel we didn't have enough time to really fix it. We think if we'd completed the visual effects, the film might have been better with some of the gory stuff left in, and we wish we'd had enough time to fix the ending. We went into the movie with a script that worked up until the last third.
The other scene that was heavily trimmed was what happened to the original crew of the Event Horizon. There was a whole kind of big, violent, kind of bloody orgy scene that was shot where essentially the crew were they were having sex, but they were also murdering each other while they were doing it. So they're kind of like fucking each other to death. And it was pretty bloody and unpleasant. And I was actually helped by another filmmaker friend of mine who's another director who
who came in to direct second unit a couple of times, called Vadim Jean, who's probably know from, like, he's done a lot of kind of romantic comedies like Leon the Pig Farmer, but he clearly has a dark side to him, because when I brought him in, because, you know, I'd started shooting these sequences and then I kind of ran out of time. I had to go back to the main unit. So he came in and he shot a lot of the kind of violent, orgiastic scenes.
There's been discussions of the Visions of Hell sequences. They had to be cut. Essentially, they're sequences of orgiastic, perverse sexuality, violence. It's very much like Hieronymus Bosch or the photography of Vidkin. I mean, I'll give you an example, but a man ramming his forearm, his fist down his mouth, ripping out his innards. There was nothing sexy about this. This is extremely dark. It is hell. It is basically things that are normally pleasurable, they're being flipped, so they're absolutely horrific. That's what the ship is. That's what we're saying the ship is taking you to. It's the inverse of what is pleasurable. It is the most painful. Obviously, some people might get pleasure from that pain, but that wasn't the idea behind it. And I really think there's a much stronger cut with some of those sequences in. Because I think at the end of the day, if you understood and accepted the idea behind the film, then those sequences would not come across as gratuitous. It's very difficult in a film which deals with hell and the devil to know how to present hell and the devil, because everybody has their specific idea of what hell and the devil is. We did it in two ways. We basically showed you the hell of guilt, when you torture yourself because you feel you did these things to these people, and how that eats you out from the inside. And then we just gave people hard and horrific glimpses of, as I said, these orgiastic, destructive scenes. I mean, there's a great moment where Fishburne is terrified and exhausted, and he leans his head against the ship, and he goes, bang! You get this sudden vision, and he goes, fuck, this thing knows it's living. It's a sentient being. It knows what I'm thinking. It's going to really screw with me. So you get a sense of something much more powerful than you are, and yet it knows everything that is in your mind.
There was also a lot of the visions of hell were cut very short. We spent a long time shooting them. I would work with the main unit all week, and then on the weekends I would also direct the second unit. So I was essentially working 7-day weeks. And over the weekends we'd bring in the occasional cast member like Jolie and spend half a day shooting particular visions of them. And we'd shoot at different frame rates. We'd shoot into mylar mirrors. Mylar is a very reflective material that's very flexible. So it's like having a mirror, but a mirror you can bend and flex and warp, or you can tap it and it kind of wobbles in a strange way. So what we do is we wouldn't shoot things directly, we'd shoot them through the mylar mirror so that we could warp and bend the images. Just to kind of give it a kind of disturbing feel. And we did some quite experimental stuff. I mean, I was really kind of playing at the weekends, shooting all of this stuff. And we used a phenomenal amount of blood and prosthetics. And a lot of that stuff, again, partly because the studio thought the movie was repetitious, there was pressure to take it out. And also partly because I think the studio were shocked at how bloody the movie was. I think they never really anticipated the film being as brutal and as bloody and frankly as disturbing as the finished film turned out. And we were shooting the Visions of Hell very much, you know, the middle towards the end of the schedule. At a point when the studio was very happy with the film, they'd seen the dailies, they knew they had some good performances, they knew it looked great. But then when they saw it assembled, they were just shocked. So there was a lot of pressure to take that out. Just because they thought it was too disturbing, it was going to marginalize the audience the movie could have had. Orbital had done a track for me for Shopping, my first film. And then I loved the track so much, I then used it on my second movie, Mortal Kombat. And that was a source track. It was off one of their albums, existing already. So by the time I got to my third movie, and I liked their music so much, I felt, you know, we should really get them involved in terms of doing the score.
We got involved in Event Horizon through Jeremy Bolt, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Jeremy Bolt.
Jeremy and Paul Anderson.
Paul Anderson had used a couple of our already written tracks. Halcyon, wasn't he?
Yeah, he used that in Shopping, but we first time we met them was because they asked us to do a track for Shopping,
yeah.
which we did. But then he used Halcyon in that, and then he used it in Mortal Kombat as well.
Yeah,
I think it was. Right. And did he? Oh, no, that's it. Yeah, but he kept using bits of our stuff prior to Event Horizon, and just got us involved in that because he just, I don't know, you know, who knows what someone's motives are, but he just said, I'd like you to sort of work on this with Michael Kamen a bit to just give it a different edge. Do you know what I mean? I suppose it's that sort of electronic sort of element, you know, back to the science fiction and synthesizers sort of vibe. Get a bit of that going on there.
I think he loves it.
Yeah,
he loves it all, doesn't he? He loves all the sort of rave music and the
oh yeah, he
house
loves.
And
yeah,
he really does. And so I think that's what he was. That's the angle he was going on, isn't it?
Yeah, he just wanted to throw a bit more of that in there, you know.
They obviously had never done the score for a movie before, so the studio felt very uncomfortable with giving, you know, a group like that the score of a major film. So what we did was we married them with Michael Kamen, who was a much more established composer, to try and get what I thought was a very successful and an unusual mix of kind of modern sounds with the more kind of classical score that Kamen provided. And they worked together very well. I mean, it's not like they did their stuff separately. They would go and have joint recording sessions, Kamen and Orbital.
Our sort of main involvement with him, the sort of big thing that we did was, he basically got like a 30-piece orchestra in he had like this big old building that he bought.
Theatre.
It's an old theatre, and he said, okay, right, let's have a jam with an orchestra, and we were like, what? You know, what do you do? You know, it's madness. And he just got this sort of 30-piece orchestra in, and we went down there, and he said, okay, you know, I've written a few things, got a few things printed up for him. He said, you know, they get a bit funny if you don't give them some music to play on, but we'll just mess with them and jam with them. And then basically we set up, you know, he set up like an 8-track recorder to record them, and we sort of walked around with our DAT machine. And basically he just started jamming with them, didn't he? Saying, okay, science fiction horror.
Okay, baby bear. I got him. Stand by, people. Stand by.
And then basically we start messing with them, and you know, like someone sort of, I don't know, just playing around with a band of 3 or 4 people in their bedroom. Do you know what I mean? And just sort of worked up all this sort of crazy stuff, and just really sort of, I don't know, sort of pushing the sounds of these people, like getting the sort of bass. Clarinet, and just recording the sort of stoppers without any, you know, sound going through it, things like that. And basically we, you know, after an afternoon of this, we took it all away and sampled it all up and just went mad with all of that, didn't we?
Yeah.
And that's that, you know, the sort of tracks that we came up with and the parts that we did were sort of based on Michael Kamen's jammings with these, you know, musicians in his big hall, and we sort of turned it into sort of more rhythm-based, you know, sort of chugging things, you know, like the opening credits, for example, you know.
We were big fans of their music, particularly this sort of muscular techno beat that they brought to it. And we had this orchestral, rather whimsical score, rather haunting score from Michael Kamen, and we wanted to bring in a bit of anger, a bit of edge. And so there's that wonderful piece, again, when you're on the central corridor of the ship towards the end when Fishburne is trying to get away, and so you have the haunting melodies from Michael Kamen, and then you have this hard rhythmic pounding from Orbital, and that's what we wanted from them to give a little sort of modern edge to what he'd done.
Like, I think preparing for a film, sit down and watch loads of films like it. And no, but you know, you do tend to do that though, don't you? Actually, I like to see. Yeah, I like to. Yeah, research. Yeah, down the video shop. The video shop. Then we've got a film job. Yeah. You know, but it's sort of, it is quite interesting because you don't, you know, on the one hand, you know, you can sort of see what works and doesn't work, and also you don't want to do something that sounds just like another film. Do you know what I mean? So you can see what to avoid as well, can't you? But yeah, I mean, it's sort of we've never really done enough to settle on a way of working. Do you know what I mean? It's always different, but I think that you know, preparing for it mainly is just getting all your bits together, getting all the film on your computer, and just then sitting down. It's sort of almost like being the pianist in the old-fashioned cinema. You just sit down and start playing things while watching it and see what sticks, you know.
Gateway opening in T-5 minutes.
We recorded sort of various bits, that, you know, knowing full well it wouldn't all be used, but because we were going away to Lollapalooza, we did sort of 2 versions, sort of 2 to 4 versions of the opening credits. Again, of which sort of we left it in the hands of Michael Kamen to mess with, and you know, he used sort of bits and edited other bits with it, and you know, do you know what I mean, from what we'd done, to make it fit the credits, and that all worked out fine. That was good, you know, so like a bit of a kit form to work from. And we did like a sort of faster version of a tune we'd done. You know, we basically did sort of quite long sections of music that had various bits, so that it's almost like giving someone sort of musical Lego to play with, you know, and chop around. But most of it appeared on the sort of soundtrack album. You know, was sort of fitted into that, but not into the film. But you know, but it was sort of like 2 or 3 sort of main things that we did, of which sort of appear in the 2 main sections of the film that they do appear in, you know, at the opening credits and the bit where they're sort of deciding to get out.
I think the idea of the event horizon is very cool. You know, in terms of science, the idea of going through a black hole. One of the scenes that Paul and I are very proud of is the scene in which Sam Neill explains what a black hole is and what an event horizon is, and how you can he takes the piece of paper and he puts the pen through it. It's just great, because we were worried about how we explain that. But I think that's appealing to people. I think the mystery of event horizons and black holes, the unknown.
I did feel I was constantly dropping black hole references into conversation for a short while afterwards, as if I was some expert on the space-time continuum. But I couldn't really do it without folding up a centerfold and sticking a pencil through.
A lot of people are very fond of Event Horizon, and a lot of people say, "Oh yeah, you designed that art." You know, it's very like, it's, you know, I think a film we're all very proud of, and I think it's not quite like any other film I've seen.
It gives you a real sense of place. I mean, I felt it when we were shooting it, even, that these were very real places. And I thought the design was magnificent. And not only the designer was responsible, but Paul was very hands-on with it all. And as scary as it is, you know, and however well Paul works his craft, and he does, he makes you jump and he makes you, you know, great laughs for release of tension, all that stuff. There's more than that. There's something thematically, I think, that really grabs your attention about being taken to your own personal hell and back. You know, the ship takes everyone to their own personal hell. And it feels like a real team of people stuck in an unpleasant environment, you know, much like Alien did. When they wake up, you really feel like these guys have been on a bunch of salvage missions together and then something goes a bit wrong. And a lot of films where a bunch of, you know, there's a team of people in peril, it feel contrived solely for our entertainment. Not with this one. But this one, it feels like it's just they're a working team. It's only a few years from now. It's the kind of people and the kind of situation that could happen. Maybe the circumstances get a little bit extraordinary.
I think Event Horizon has a very strange quality about it, which is, on the surface, it's a fairly straightforward genre piece, science fiction, haunted house kind of film. But I think below that there are some very adult themes about the way that the characters deal with their past and the things that really scare them. And I think that for a lot of the audience that touched a very deep nerve.
It's you know, it's an unusual film, and it does have a quality, I think, that is just just a little bit edgy, a little bit different, and visceral. I think's exciting. And
I think the film deals with a lot of dark subject matter, and it has a real kind of obvious religious undercurrent to it. And I think those kind of things don't date. The idea was, although it was set on a spaceship, what we were making essentially was a haunted house movie and a movie about hell. And I think in that way it wasn't science fiction, and it was dealing with darker, deeper issues. And I think those issues are still as relevant now as they were then.
I think the film is frightening. I think the film makes you feel anxious. I think that people being tortured by sins, by their guilt, is a very universal feeling. I think that the guilt in the film, the mother who's deserted her child, the husband who's deserted his wife, the commander who let a man die, these are all very universal feelings of guilt. So I think there is something quite appealing on quite a mass level in that way. They're not so specific that you can't really connect with it.
I think the film is still popular because it touches on the base roots of fear that's in everybody's head, and that is where you travel out beyond what you know and into a world you don't know. And I think there's a lot of psychological imagery in there, which still gets under people's skin. It's still a scary movie. It's the haunted emptiness of the ship. It's the brilliant performances of the actors, and hopefully it's some of the effects as well that grab you and take you in and take you to another place, a very scary, lonely, empty place, but still a great place to go.
And you look at movies like The Haunting and like The Shining, and I'm not saying we're anywhere near as good as those movies, but those movies tended to not be big films when they were released, but kind of gain a cult audience over time, because they're films that you talk about. You talk about the ending of The Shining, you talk about the ending of The Haunting. If it's all tied up in a nice, neat bow, there's nothing to talk about. That was a great movie experience, but I don't really need to discuss it. And I think Event benefits from that. I think the things that hurt us originally are the things that help sustain us now and mean that we still have an audience.